Welcome to the Building Bite Podcast, a podcast for construction owners, contractors, and insurance professionals where you can hear from the experts about tips to help you be successful. My name is Peter Duggan. I'm President and CEO of Proactive, and I'm here with my co-host, Mike Diercksen, Proactive Senior Innovation and Content Solutions Consultant, and our featured guest, Cheri Hanes, Senior SDI Construction Risk Engineer at AXA XL. Cheri, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Very happy to be here with you guys.
I know. Thank you so much for being on the show. And Mike, how are you?
Doing great, Peter. It's really a pleasure to have Cheri on the show and excited to learn a little bit more about what we're talking about.
Same. Definitely. And I know, Cheri, you and I have worked together for a while, and that's been very nice, but we've never really dug into this topic that we will today. Today's show is called 5 Considerations for Mass Timber Construction. And I know you are a mass timber expert. I've seen you speak at ERMI on the topic. I've seen you write white papers on the topic. So this is going to be awesome. But before we get into mass timber, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are now?
Yeah, absolutely. Before coming to AXA XL in 2012, I worked with Yates Construction in their Fort Worth office and operations. Prior to that, I was with Lend-Lease and Precon in their Dallas office. And in both of those roles, I worked in sustainability or helping buildings, walk down the path of getting certified through LEED or CHIPS or whatever system they were in as well. And prior to that, my way back experience is having been a partner in a small renovation and tenant improvement firm. And that's really where my passion for sub-default comes from, because if my sub defaulted there, I felt it in a very visceral way. So, it was really, truly on me to make it right at that point. So all of those things led me to AXA XL as the second risk engineer hired after Jim Reichert, our risk engineering leader for SDI. It's been quite a ride, a lot of fun. I'm in a leadership role now, a team lead, which is really fun. It's such a strong team, and we may have different roles across the team, but we all do the same job. And just trying to help people do better at construction is what drives all of us. So we're all pulling in the same direction. It's a lot of fun.
That's great, Cheri. Yeah, no, it's been a pleasure to have some of the other risk engineers on the show as well. So right off the bat, I know Peter announced the title, the 5 Considerations for Mass Timber. I think it's important to set the stage here. And for some of our listeners who may not know, there are differences between wood frame and mass timber. Would you be able to help elaborate on that a little bit, explain what those are?
Yeah, absolutely. I think everyone knows light wood frame. It's the normal kind of construction that you see frequently on multifamily or residential projects that uses regular 2x material that you would see at Home Depot, 2x4s, 2x6s, et cetera. Now, mass timber uses that material too, but to be called mass timber, the material has to be engineered into a larger beam or panel. And the result is that it's stronger, straighter, stiffer, able to be used as an actual structural component of a large building, but still very much lighter than concrete or steel. But we should note that mass timber is usually used together with steel or with concrete and structure. It's often a hybrid type of approach.
Okay, and you mentioned larger, so you're combining the materials together, and some of our listeners may be thinking, okay, logs, big logs, but that's not necessarily it, right? This isn't log cabins. Can you share a little bit more, like what does that process look like? How are they combining those materials to create mass timber?
Yeah, the larger logs that you are thinking of, that's another method of construction called heavy timber framing. One of the benefits of mass timber over heavy timber framing is just the sustainability of the product. Mass timber uses that smaller, same 2x dimensional lumber that we were talking about earlier and puts it together. So it's able to use smaller trees that can be sustainably grown basically as a crop rather than cutting mature timber that's valuable in a lot of other ways. And maybe the highest value is for it to continue to stand in a forest. The closest thing to a log cabin in mass timber, and one I think most everyone is probably familiar with, is glulam. And if you've ever been in a Cabela's or like a church with a big, large span beam that might at first look like a solid piece of wood, if you look closely, you can see that there are strands of lumber that are joined together, and that's glulam, and a type of mass timber that's been around for quite some time. So there's your log cabin that somebody might be thinking of. That's as close as probably. I mean, I guess you could build a log cabin out of mass timber, but somebody's probably done it. Other common types of mass timber include CLTs, one you hear the most about. Some people kind of use that CLT word interchangeably with mass timber. It's actually, one subset, and it's one that takes those 2x materials and places them perpendicular layers to one another, glues it together, presses it, and forms really large panels. Then there's also NLT, nail laminated timber, and DLT, which is dowel laminated timber. Those both place the 2x members on narrow edge parallel to one another and either mechanically fasten through with nails or screws, or in the case of DLT, uses wooden dowels to fasten it together. So there's a product that's only wood. It doesn't have any adhesive. It doesn't have any other types of fasteners. And really, those are just the highlights. There are a lot of types of mass timber and more being created all the time, but those are the main ones.
Good breakdown, Cheri. And now let's turn to the insurance part of mass timber, right? So mass timber is a little bit different than wood framing, particularly through the eyes of the insurer. So can you walk the audience through what are the significant benefits first of mass timber, and then how do insurance carriers look at mass timber differently than wood framing?
Yeah, there are a lot of benefits around mass timber. It's sustainable, obviously. It's lighter, so there are cost and schedule savings. It takes a smaller crew to place it. So there are, labor concerns in many, many markets, right? Maybe all. And, that is beneficial. And then there are some political or, regional geographic benefits. If it's a mass timber producing region, mass timber makes a lot of sense as an industry there, right? It's a way to support the local economy. So those are some of the benefits. As far as from an insurer's perspective, though, it's a challenge. People compare it with light frame, and I think a lot of insurers tend to kind of lump it in with light frame. We know light wood frame. We know it very well. We've got a ton of data to draw on to predict its performance and likelihood of loss, and we like that. Insurance wants to know what can go wrong, what's most likely to go wrong. That's our question, whether the product is general liability insurance, builder's risk, professional, or sub-default. Mass timber is new, while the roots of it go way back, and there are structures that are, historic that are technically mass timber. For the insurance industry, it's considered new. So there are questions that are really hard to get our hands around. We don't have robust actuarial information for mass timber, and that's the foundation that we build insurance on, is that actuarial data. Without it, we really feel like we're guessing. And while we may be able to get to a really good educated guess based on a lot of science and testing, it's still a guess. You could compare it with looking at a BIM, digital model of a building versus looking at the actual structure. Like technically we think, yeah, okay, this is it. This is how it will perform. This is what we can expect. But it's not the real thing. It's not the real data that we like to rely on as insurers. And absent that data, insurers default conservative. It's what we do. There's a perception of a wild card type of risk, and insurance is going to reflect that uncertainty. And a lot of that uncertainty circles around fire and water performance, but there's also supply chain, transportation, site practices, life cycle concerns, the durability or performance over time of the material. And that's a lot of uncertainty altogether, and definitely a challenge to feel like we're getting it right, which we all want to do.
Yeah, and I can't wait to get to those key considerations. But the data is coming in, right? There is a lot of mass timber being used. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in the U.S. with mass timber.
Yeah, there's some really interesting projects that have been built and that are being built. Carbon 12 in Portland was kind of the first considered tall mass timber building built without a special approval process. No surprise, Oregon was the first state to allow buildings of a certain size with mass timber. It's a timber producing region. So, back to that political geographic benefit of it, there you have it. So it supports the timber industry there. T3 is a concept people may see more of, or I'm pretty sure you will see more of. T3 is a Hanes concept. It stands for Transit, Technology, and Timber. So they look for opportunities to bring those three things together and build a commercial space in areas where they can get that all together. There's one in Atlanta, Toronto, Minneapolis. There are more in the works that I know of. And then, one of the most interesting ones that's going on right now is called Ascent. It's in Milwaukee. It's going to be 25 stories tall, which will be the tallest in the world when it's built. Probably not for long because architects are very competitive. So something's already on the drawing board that's taller, right? But, for now, that's quite an accomplishment. And it took a really long collaborative process to get that building approved because it does not fit into any code. It had to, walk down a performance path to show that it was going to meet specifically the fire department's concerns. So there's a lot on the drawing boards and, why not? If I were an architect, I would definitely want to be designing this stuff. It's gorgeous. It has all of these environmental benefits. And in many instances, the sustainability and environmental considerations are driving the choices to use mass timber, not just for the architects who are designing it, but for the owners. And that's really important. It's able to be sustainably grown versus being mined. It serves as a carbon and heat sink over the course of its life. And then it sequesters that carbon while it's in the building. And it's made for deconstructibility and reuse. So it's hard to beat all of those things as a way to meet companies' corporate sustainability responsibility goals. And, it also happens to command higher rents and be more easily rented because people just love being around these materials. Concept called biophilia, where people perform better when they can see, bits of nature. And then that's what this wood can bring to a building.
You just laid out so much whiffum for owners, right? What's in it for me? All kinds, higher rents, happier tenants, all that good stuff. Sustainability, excellent.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you brought up the sustainability portion of that, Cheri, because you look anywhere and you see that's really something the market is gravitating to, right? Owners know people are looking for ways to be renewable. They're looking for sustainable sources. You mentioned the carbon impact. Mm-hmm. I mean, that is certainly trending right now, and then for good reason. As you laid out those several. I mean, if nothing else, higher rents. Owners love that. But is there a reason then that maybe not everyone's doing this? Like, why wouldn't everyone be rushing to the mass timber market then?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people are rushing to that market. It seems to be doubling the number of projects year over year from the time that I started following it kind of back in 2018 to now, every year, double. So it's picking up quite a lot of steam, but kind of the risks that are involved that people are aware of and it's holding some people back is just the general newness of the product. We kind of talked about that a little bit already. The inexperience of the various partners in the mass timber building space, the owners, the designers, the engineers, everyone needs experience and everyone needs to be qualified. And you don't want to be on anyone's learning curve any more than is absolutely necessary, right? And for that same reason, qualifying subs is a particular challenge. Even getting accurate bids is a challenge when in most markets, nobody's priced it before. They don't have the experience with it. So they're going to give you, a really high estimate, which is in the presence of uncertainty, anyone would do the same. Sometimes it's possible to leverage manufacturer experience in selecting subs to leverage the relationships that they already have, and that can be a really good idea.
What is your typical type of sub that you see installing this material, Cheri?
That varies a lot. It varies by location. There can be a variety of folks who are used to using and placing a lot of work with cranes. So there's choices to be made there. In union locations, and probably most typically, it'll be carpenters or framers or heavy timber framers And if using a framer, then we go back to the challenge of qualifying those same subs, because framers in general tend to be lower capitalized and have some challenges of their own. And, place that in the concept of where we are right now with the supply chain and material escalation challenges we're having. And the finances of these entities really matter, because there can be impacts in that regard. And, if we go back to kind of the risks, there are a couple more that I haven't talked about yet. Everyone's concerned about delamination of the material itself. There are generally two causes of delamination, which would be manufacturing errors, or water is considered to be a potential delamination risk. If you talk about manufacturing issues, I think everyone probably has heard of the PV Hall incident at OSU. There were a cluster of issues there, and I don't want to oversimplify it, but long story short, there was a delamination that resulted from some panels actually coming apart, which is a really big deal. And ultimately, 85 of these very large panels had to be replaced in the structure. And the root cause seems to be a tiny, extremely innocent sounding manufacturing change that no one would have thought would have had such an impact, but it did. So that goes back to the point of, experience really matters. Good to note, though, as a result of that incident, the industry jumped right on it, made some changes to testing and materials to prevent a recurrence of the same type of situation again. So very responsive to that situation that happened. And then on delamination, also people have a concern around water causing delamination. The adhesives are designed for that to not happen as a result of water, but wood is a natural product, so it can behave a little strangely sometimes. But I think more commonly, what could cause problems with water is the water migrating through the building and causing discoloration of the materials, or even potentially mold. So that has to be thought about. Both of them matter, but water has to be monitored and managed in both cases, both the environmental water that may come in from rain or the building systems water once that's charged up within the building. And learning the various techniques for managing water on a mass timber project is a critical step to getting it right. And then we have concerns around materials and supply chain. Like when you're expecting such a large component of a structure to come in from off-site, they come in ready to install to the exact dimensions with all of the penetrations already included. They're produced using a BIM model via CNC technology. Any interruption getting that material to the site can potentially be a large impact. So the whole production and transportation network needs to be tracked and monitored with complete transparency through the whole life cycle. And that can include a lot of folks. It's manufacturers and shippers and truckers, the whole kind of planes, trains, and automobiles kind of thing. It can come by a variety of means to the site. And then once the material arrives on site, it has to be handled with a degree of care as well. And it needs to be ready to go once it's needed and in the right place at the right time. And all of that requires some focused management on site.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I see where you mean then, with talking about that precision and bringing everything from off-site, how regions that support timber, right, that have that locally there, it's just that much easier, right, to only move it a little bit as far as goes across the country.
But the ocean.
Or across the ocean, exactly. Yeah. So, Cheri, what about fire, right? I mean, you mentioned delamination, and that makes perfect sense to me, but obviously fire is, wood is flammable, and that is something that everyone knows. So is fire a concern with mass timber?
Yeah, I mean, while mass timber is known to have a degree of fire resistance because just the density of the material and its ability to protect itself with a layer of char in a fire situation. And there's some really impressive research and studies out there to demonstrate that. But it is still combustible, and that, of course, is the first thing that people think of when they hear wood construction. So absolutely, fire is a concern, and that risk does have to be managed through a variety of hot works protocols. Housekeeping is really important, as loading up anything with a bunch of combustible materials that could serve as tinder, basically, could be a risk.
And Cheri, one of the things I love about the AXA XL risk engineering team led by Jim Reichert is not only do you all identify the risks, but then you move to, okay, how do we manage those risks? And I think that's what I'm really looking forward to, is hearing from you now okay, we now know what the risks are. Let's talk about how do we manage those risks. So can you give us some ideas? I think this is where your 5 points come in. Can you give us some ideas about how to manage those risks that we laid out?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll kind of start back at the top with experience. Understanding who you're going to be working with in a mass timber project and their level of experience is really, really important. People need to choose to do business with those who have as much experience as possible. Some people have really specialized in mass timber and they are worth seeking out. And then that kind of rolls into the question of, well, how are you going to place this material? Which sub are you going to use? Or are you going to do it with your internal forces? Are you going to let the manufacturer subcontract then manage that, which is sometimes an option? Just generally being strategic with the placement strategy. Who's going to hold that subcontract if there is one? Who's going to manage the work? Are you going to use the manufacturers and consultants' expertise to the highest degree that you can to smooth the way? And then just, really drilling down on the bids that are received to make sure that they really understand and have a good concept of what's going to be required of them.
And Cheri, sorry, but so where would that process start then? We talked about a strategic process there and understanding who's going to go where. Who starts that discussion in your mind?
That's, typically going to be the builder who is actually going to place the work. They're going to be the ones who are concerned with who's going to actually put the material into the structure. Generally, builders manage a lot of subcontractors, and this could be yet another one, or they may decide to take it on with internal forces. I know some builders who've done that with great success, but it starts at that really early pre-con stage of, hey, do we even want to get involved in mass timber or not, is
right.
The decision of, okay, how are we going to manage placing something we've never placed before, which is, it's not a new consideration for builders. There's new materials all the time that they have to figure out how they're going to get incorporated properly into a structure. So it's a similar consideration. Yeah, and then we talked about water, right? To manage water risks, it's important that builders put those right strategies in place to really robustly manage water on the projects, more so than probably any other type of structure. There's a lot of tech out there for weather warnings and leak detection, and even to shut off valves if one were to detect a leak remotely with an app on your phone, which is kind of crazy to me, but it exists, and this is a perfect application for that. Other than that, builders should have a rain crew ready with the right instructions and equipment to clear water from the structure in the event of some kind of water release, be it external or internal. They need to use temporary measures to manage water that does get into the structure as it's being built, and that could include tapes, temporary membranes, flashings, caulks, and just generally prioritizing getting the building dried in quickly. And they might want to consider implementing a wet works permit protocol similar to the hot works permits we're pretty much all familiar with now. If they haven't already, that can be a good way to make sure that water is being managed appropriately on these projects. And then for the materials and supply chain piece, just understanding where the materials are coming from and everyone who's going to touch it along the way, and setting up the comms and tracking for that whole production and transportation network. That's a big challenge, but it's one we're facing across the industry, not just with mass timber. It just happens to kind of be coming to a head with mass timber right now, that you need to understand every step along the way of getting it produced and brought to the site. So first they have to consider the sequence of the materials placement, plan that into the work. They need to have the materials arrive on site sequenced, even if it costs more, so that it will save some time, but more importantly, it'll save some handling of the material and be safer, right? So if you can move the material fewer times, that's obviously going to be safer, but it's going to be safer for the materials as well. There's not as big a chance of damaging a panel as it goes into the structure. So if builders can talk to the manufacturers and to other experienced builders, I've heard some really great cross-pollination amongst builders with regards to mass timber to help each other understand what the lessons learned are and what the requirements for storage and best practices may be, and then, digging in, making a plan, assigning responsibility, and implementing it to make it happen. And then fire, kind of the last thing we talked about there, just because it's less of a fire risk than lightwood frame, It doesn't mean all the same strategies should not be in use that would be for light wood frame. Hot works permit protocols and solid housekeeping. I think I mentioned both of those early. Those are critical. You gotta do it. To take it a step further, builders can utilize technology to monitor for smoke and or heat. There can be on-site security, 24/7 to watch for fire, also for vandalism. So that could be pretty important strategy. And talking to local fire departments about what they're building and, getting them even out on site to look at it. They love that. They want to know what's going on. They really do. I'm married to a retired fireman, so I know of which I speak. They love going out and seeing, something different that's going in and being able to strategize and say, okay, if X happens, then Y is what we'll do. And I know they welcome the chance to understand that risk better.
That's excellent. So Cheri, looking at this for the audience, we always like to give the audience some takeaways. So we've covered a lot of great material today with you, but if there were 3 key takeaways that the audience could leave here today with, what would you say those should be?
Yeah, let me break it down by groups, right? For builders or contractors, the stuff looks like Legos, and it kind of is. It's a pretty cool system, right? But don't be fooled by the simplicity of the materials. There are differences that can mean success or failure, or at least a loss of profit if you don't understand what you're signing up for up front. So, really do your homework. For insurers, I would say this needs to be a conversation. We need to make sure we fully understand the risk and don't just, go with our gut. It's wood and treat it like light wood frame. It's not the same. And for anyone, there's a really great resource out there in a site called Woodworks that can point them to excellent research on mass timber's performance for fire, water, seismic, wind, et cetera. There's been a ton of work done to prove how this material performs. And then I guess for architects, if there are any on, keep designing this stuff. There is so much to love about this material, including decarbonizing the building industry a little bit, which we so definitely need in the face of climate change.
So true. And Cheri, if we were going to give our audience one action item, right? If they're into, I want to get moving on mass timber, where should they start?
Yeah. So I guess I have to give you a little bit of a multi-phased single answer for that. I would say to invest in that research, planning, and education before you invest in pre-con on one of these structures. And, begin with the research, know what's happening out there before you dive in. Once you're ready, start talking to one another, sharing information. This is truly a rising tide floats all boats kind of situation. So builders need to get it right, together. Talk to their carriers, if they have a risk engineer, talk to your risk engineer, talk to peer groups, reach out to other builders that who have done this type of work, and we'll get it right together. And then take that research and let that inform your planning. First and foremost, don't bury your head in the sand about any of the risks that we've talked about. These things will happen in some cases, or we wouldn't be worried about it, right? And no one wants to be that guy. So think about all of those variables and make aggressive and proactive plans to ensure that you're actively preparing for success in all of those venues. And then that opens the door for education. Once these plans are formalized, communicate them out to all the team members and bring everyone along on the journey.
Excellent content there, Cheri. I think everyone's going to really learn a lot from this conversation today. So as we start to wind things down, though, we always do like to do some rapid fire questions. So if you're ready, we'll
Sure.
throw a few your way. We did deep dive on mass timber. Maybe it's obvious. What gets you the most energized about work right now? What are you excited about professionally?
Yeah, great question. And not just mass timber, although I'm really excited about mass timber, but in general, I'm really excited about the potential for insurance carriers to drive and to empower the use of sustainable materials. This is a corporate goal of AXA XL, aligned with our own corporate responsibility goal. 2 of the pillars of our approach are to respond to climate change and to deliver sustainable insurance solutions. And mass timber is just one of the ways that we think we can address those. And that's a super exciting and interesting proposition.
On the flip side, Cheri, what keeps you up at night professionally?
I'm a really light sleeper, so lots of things. And generally, it's whatever project I'm working on at the time. I keep my iPad beside the bed, even though they say not to do that, because it's not unusual for me to wake up and just need to get something out of my head and onto a note so that I can possibly go back to sleep. But then whether that makes sense in the morning or not, that's a whole separate issue. You know how it goes, I'm sure.
Scrap that note. I'll keep that one. Scrap that one.
It's like another language. Sometimes you're like, what was I thinking? I don't even know. Okay, and so then, Cheri, in what ways do you feel you're professionally still growing in your career?
Oh, yeah. So construction is an endlessly creative industry, and anyone who thinks otherwise really is just not paying attention. We're talking about mass timber today, and that's pretty new, and people are working on how to, it's crazy stuff like 3D print a whole building, or even how to grow a building out of biological materials. That's nuts, right? And we're leveraging technology more and more and more robustly than ever, and there's really just this tidal wave of tech coming at us right now. And, at AXA, I get to work with the very best builders in the entire space, and just trying to keep up with their innovations as they embrace them is pretty thrilling.
Is there anything, Cheri, we should have asked you that we didn't?
Well, we didn't really touch on just how big of a disruption it can be when the early design is not final or committed to. I guess everyone needs to understand what the impact of making a change. That's part of that education piece, really, but we didn't touch on it specifically. Everyone needs to understand that if you make any change to the design as you go, it can be a really outsized impact on a mass timber project, and it could absolutely impact the entire project's budget and schedule.
I'm glad you raised that. Yes, and in addition to surprises like that, is there anything, or maybe one thing, people may be surprised to hear about you?
I feel like maybe a lot of people know this already, but maybe that I took a sabbatical to sail the Caribbean from 2016 to 2018 on a sailboat, just me and my husband.
Wait a second. How many years are in between 16 and 18? My math's pretty good. That's a long time of sailing. Good for you.
Yeah, we were out of the country for 3 years, I think.
Oh, wow.
And a lot of people would say that's pretty risky for a risk engineer on a number of levels. And it was. There were weather events and shark events and mechanical failures. But there were also so many amazing experiences and people and places. And we made lifelong friends. It was a life-changing bucket list experience. And I'm really, really glad we did it.
Yeah, that's awesome. I was going to say, that seems like multiple hurricane seasons to be in the Caribbean. So that's something.
We experienced that Cheri had insurance, right?
That's it. So, Cheri, as we're wrapping this up, one thing we always love to do with our guests, this is the Building Bite. That is BIM insurance technology with the experts. You are our expert. So we'd like to ask you, what are you taking a bite out of today? I know you're a Texas girl. You are down there in the barbecue. Is there a place in mind that you really love?
We have a favorite Tex-Mex place in Dallas called the Blue Goose. We've been going there since the late 80s, if you can believe that. Same restaurant, same the whole time, right? And it's always a treat. So we might indulge in some of that.
All right, heading down to Dallas.
Come on.
Really going to the Blue Goose. I mean, that's what a endorsement since the 80s. That's consistency, right? That there's never been a bad thing. That's awesome.
That sounds multi-generational. Cheri, thanks so much for chatting with us today. If the listeners are looking to hook up and learn a little bit more about mass timber or any of the other great things you raised today, where can they find you?
Yeah, absolutely. My email is cheri.hanes@axaxl.com, and I'm on LinkedIn as Cheri Hanes, so feel free to look me up.
Thank you so much, Cheri, for being with us today.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to The Building Bite. This podcast has been brought to you by Proactive. Check us out on thebuildingbite.com, where you can subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on social media for all future The Building Bite news and updates. You can also find us on your favorite apps, including Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Amazon. If you have ideas for episode topics that we should cover on the show, or you know somebody who would be a perfect guest, let us know at connect@thebuildingbite.com.